The Cincinnati Bengals need a new offensive coordinator. Let's talk about the latest and what the requirements will be for the Bengals to fill that job.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm Jake Liscow. He's James Rapien. We are the Locked On Bengals podcast. You can find this show on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. In this episode, brought to you by PrizePicks, where we're going to talk more about the Bengals' future at offensive coordinator. PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code LockedOnNFL to get a first deposit match up to $100. And James, we welcome in everyone who makes us their first listen, everyone who's an everydayer. You probably caught the 2 episodes yesterday. If you're an everydayers, we got the late news that Brian Callahan will be coaching the Tennessee Titans, and the presumed successor, Dan Pitcher, probably working his way through the offensive coordinator process, potentially with a number of teams. Think he's still the first choice for the Bengals, but the Bengals do have a process to go through here.
No doubt. And he is their first choice. I would be shocked if he wasn't. If you want to call him the front runner, call him that, because that's what he is. But he has options. And Dan Pitcher didn't know for sure that Brian Callahan was going to get a head coaching job. And so he had to do his due diligence like he did last year with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And it turns out that NFL teams are impressed when you not only help Joe Burrow become the quarterback that he's become, but you help Jake Browning go 4-3 down the stretch and post historic numbers over his first 4 starts, and help the Bengals win 3 straight games, all of the above, right? Dan Pitcher's, it's risen. His profile has risen this year. What he was able to do with Burrow goes without saying, but obviously what he did with Jake Browning. And I think Zac Taylor deserves credit too, because he hasn't shied away, whether it's Brian Callahan or Dan Pitcher, when we ask about them, when asked about, oh, how valuable is Brian or how valuable is Pitch, he gives so much credit to those guys. And I don't think it's lip service. I think it's how he genuinely feels. So now that Brian is Nashville bound, and I'm sure that'll become official at some point this week, and he'll be announced and we'll see him in blue and all of those things. Well, Dan Pitcher is the focus for this Bengals organization. I have no doubt about that. But to your point, there is a process. They're not just going to hire a pitcher. They'll conduct multiple interviews. And at the same time, I still think Dan Pitcher, it's his job. I don't even want to say to lose, because we can get into the scenarios of how he doesn't become Bengals offensive coordinator, but he's certainly the favorite for that job.
I think saying it's his job to lose is fair. Like, if he doesn't want it, that counts as a way he would lose it. I think that
Does
they
it?
do have to go.
Does he lose it if he picks somewhere else? I don't think that. I feel like that doesn't apply.
I mean, it's his job, right? Like, if he wants the job, the Bengals, I think, want him to be the offensive coordinator. Zac Taylor wants him to be the Bengals' next offensive coordinator. I think that's the point that I was trying to make in retort there.
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you think it comes down to then? They still have some other interviews. We can get into the process part, the behind the scenes. What's your biggest thought here or concern? Because I have one, and I want to know if you feel the same way.
I think there's 2. One more than the other, one a little bit more nebulous than the other, but one that is very obvious is money. The other one that I think is also fairly obvious is responsibility in terms of specifically play calling, which has been discussed quite a bit. We've talked about it on this podcast as well. Does Dan Pitcher want to call plays? Probably yes. Probably, if you're going to be an offensive coordinator in the NFL, you would prefer to call plays given the option. But it's not necessarily as simple as just that. You also have to think about the opportunity after you've seen your former boss, Brian Callahan, get a head coaching job, and your trajectory. What's going to give you the best chance of becoming a head coach if that is Dan Pitcher's goal, which you would imagine it is for many of these coaches in the NFL. The opportunity to be a head coach of an NFL team is the ultimate lifelong dream. And that's where they want to be. That's the top of the mountain. And then taking your team to success as a head coach, obviously, after that. But those are the factors that I have to imagine are in play for Dan Pitcher. If it is as simple as he's making a choice and has a few teams to choose from, because we know now, officially reported, we've hinted at it and talked about the Patriots, certainly. But in addition to New Orleans, who wants him for a second interview, scheduled to fly to Vegas, scheduled to meet with the Patriots. Probably by the time you've listened to this, he's met with the Patriots. So there are other teams interested in his services, and the Bengals are competing with some teams that don't necessarily offer the same, offensive personnel in terms of they don't have Joe Burrow, but could offer other things to try to pry him away.
Yeah, it's interesting because the money factor, it's simple. If Zac Taylor values him the way I think he does, if Joe Burrow values him the way I think Joe Burrow does, well then why wouldn't the Bengals be willing to get close or figure out money-wise how to make it work? I think that part's easy, right? At the same time, the Bengals are probably like, well, this is a hot job. This is a job. No. The money part shouldn't be a factor. They have the money for it. And so money was mine. And that would be the one thing that to me cannot be the hang up. We can get into the play calling in a second, but and I'm not saying we found this out or we will find this out, but let's say the Raiders offer him 1.5 million per, whatever. And I don't know if that's the case. I have no idea. But let's just say it's $1 million. Let's make it easier. And the Bengals are at $700,000. Well, then just go to the $1 million and get your guy because Zach loves him and Joe loves him. It's pretty easy to me. And yet we'll see, right, Jake, if that's the hang up or not.
There is a process. And like we talked about, there are all these factors out there. Play calling, is that a big deal for Dan Pitcher? Maybe we'll find out about that eventually. Maybe not. Maybe the Bengals will budge there. Maybe not. But you're right. If it's money and that's the difference, just do it.
It can't be. That's the one thing that isn't acceptable. I want to get into the play calling part because I think that that's more interesting.
Yeah.
Because if Dan Pitcher is demanding play calling duties, I have some thoughts on it. That's all. But curveball, we didn't plan this. I pulled a clip from Joe Burrow discussing Dan Pitcher. Should we toss to it? We shall.
It seems like you've got a really good relationship with Dan Pitcher. You guys have similar personalities. Is that true?
Yeah, I would say that. And I think that's why we mesh so well in the meeting room and on the sideline. We have a great working relationship. And, really, I say this all the time, but I couldn't ask for a better group of coaches for my skill set and for what I do.
That's Joe Burrow ahead of the AFC Championship game, January 27th last year, ahead of the game against the Chiefs. Clearly, he's on board with Dan Pitcher and likes how Pitcher has helped him develop.
That's the quote that I referenced in our bonus episode, but better to hear it, of course, from Joe Burrow directly than to hear it from me. I think we can all agree on that without much debate. A lot more to talk about, I think, around the future of the Bengals OC position, some other coaches that some fans are excited about, the requirements that the Bengals have to meet in order to actually make a hire at OC, and potentially quarterbacks coach as well. So we can continue that conversation coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America, the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS because it's you against the numbers, you versus the PrizePicks projections. You don't have to worry about pros, sharks, thousands of other players. No. It's you against PrizePicks and their projections. You pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. In fact, you can win up to 25 times your money. So maybe you think Patrick Mahomes is going to throw for less than his number of passing yards, or that Lamar Jackson is going to throw for less than his number of passing yards. You could combine both of those. You could throw in Travis Kelce going for less than his number of receiving yards. Notice how, Jake, I'm slanting this towards the Bengals here and everyone going for less than. You can do whatever you want with PrizePicks. And right now, you're going to get $100. How? First deposit match up to $100 by going to prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl and use code lockedonnfl for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl with code lockedonnfl for a first deposit match up to $100.
James, there are some hot names on the OC market. Should we talk about those and some of the people that some fans in particular, I think I've seen quite a bit of chatter on social media about in the last 12 to 24 hours since Brian Callahan was poached away by the Tennessee Titans? Where do you want to go?
Real quick, there's a scenario where if I'm the Bengals, I tell Dan no. If the numbers are the same money wise, but he's demanding to call plays, I would say I'm good. And Zach, I'll tell you, call his bluff, and also be comfortable with letting Dan leave, because Dan can be awesome, and this is nothing personal. But the Bengals offensive coordinator job, regardless of who's calling plays, is one of the best jobs in the league when it comes to getting a shot at becoming a next head coach. That is a better job than the Raiders offensive coordinator job. I don't care if you're calling plays. I don't care if you're setting schedules. I don't care what you're doing. I don't care if they give you a Lambo to drive to practice every day. It doesn't matter. It's not as good of a job. And we heard why about, 3 minutes ago. Joe Burrow, we heard from him, right? Joe Burrow. There's no Joe Burrow in New England. They might have a top pick. Okay, that's fine. It's still, there's a lot of risk there. There's a lot of risk moving your family to Vegas. Dan Pitcher could stay right here, assuming the money's the same. Now, if the money's different, I'm not counting your pockets. I get it. But from a play calling standpoint, there's as much risk as there is reward with that. Ask the Eagles offensive coordinator, Brian Johnson, how quickly those things can change. There's stability here if the money's the same. And I'm the Bengals, I wouldn't necessarily give Dan Pitcher the play calling duties unless Zach decides he wants to do that anyways. But I wouldn't do that to keep him here. I think that's too much.
It's interesting. I wonder how much they feel that way. I think that they may really value Pitcher and may be willing to do that to keep him, just because it would mean that there's this coach that they really like, that they've developed, that they've seen grow into the role he's in right now, where he is a very in-demand offensive coordinator and or very in-demand candidate for offensive coordinator jobs, I guess we should say. Maybe that's something that they're willing to consider. Maybe not. Maybe to your point, Zac Taylor says, I'm going to do it. This is a great job. I feel like I can replace with any number of very viable candidates. And the Bengals will go through an interview process. We keep alluding to, they're required to, in fact. And so maybe they feel that way. Maybe not. We'll find out likely very soon about some of these questions. I just think it's interesting. And
Yeah.
there's also the question of whether or not that would be good, whether or not, you talk about potential growing pains as a play caller. And on the other hand, you talk about potentially changing it up and some benefits that could come from a different primary play caller. There's two sides to that.
No doubt. And so I tried to choose my words very carefully there, not to you, but just to be clear, I would not, if I'm Zac Taylor, give up play calling to keep Dan Pitcher. If that's the reason you're doing it. If the reason you're doing it is because you think that it's going to make the team better and potentially raise the level of the offense and help you become a better head coach and help the team because you think Dan is just this awesome play call, like potential play call. Like if you think the upside is there, that's different than, Dan coming to the table saying, hey, the Raiders are giving me play calling duties and X amount of money. You're giving me X amount of money, but I want play calling duties or I'm leaving.
It's one of
Joe
those
Burrow's in this building, son. That's all. That's all I say.
It's one of those things where Pitcher has a leverage to ask for it, right? And while that you're right, you shouldn't be bullied into it or anything like that. If you're Taylor and you're thinking about the upside, like you just said, and you come to the conclusion that, oh yeah, well then I can, focus more on these other things instead of having to think about play calling. That's something that I can delegate that will free me up to do other things better. And I think Pitcher will be really good at it. It's just an opportunity to think about it, right? It's an opportunity to entertain the possibility. And then if you reach that conclusion, because that's the only way it happens. I don't think that would be just, a blackmail kind of thing. Like, hey man, I'm going to leave if you don't give me play calling, right? Like, I don't think that would play. I don't think that would be a healthy environment for your OC head coach relationship going forward. But it's just, you sit back and you think about it when presented with that argument, and then maybe you come to that conclusion, like you said.
Sure. Yeah. And it's an interesting dilemma for sure. And I think we both know Zac Taylor doesn't want to lose both these guys, and he lost one
Yes.
of them. So, and you know who else knows that? Dan Pitcher knows that. So it's
Mhm.
just, it's an interesting dynamic, and it is business, the business side of it. So we'll see there. But to your point, there are a lot of names being thrown out there as far as, is that where you wanted to go? The Brady
Yeah.
scenario?
Mm-hmm.
Oh man. People on social media talking about Joe Brady, a couple of things. He's still the offensive coordinator of the Bills, and I know he has that interim tag, but unless there's some kind of sign of them wanting to move on from him and or Sean McDermott, you think Joe Brady's going to just say, "Oh, well, I'm the interim right now, but I'm going to leave even though I have a real shot to be the OC here, and I'm going to be the OC here." That's what he probably knows he's going to be, to not call plays or even call plays, let's say, in Cincinnati. Like, it is so pie in the sky unrealistic. And it's because Brady is in Buffalo with Josh Allen. This isn't the Raiders OC job. It's a real OC job, a good job. And so I think unless there's a real shakeup to that staff in Buffalo, I don't think he'll be available. And it's not like the Bengals could just request him right now because he is an OC. So they couldn't bring him in right now. And so I think it's a lot of unrealistic thoughts, even though I do get it because Joe Brady's interesting, but I just don't think he's available.
I don't think he's available either. The one interview request we've seen for Joe Brady was for a head coaching job.
Yep.
The
Correct.
Atlanta Falcons wanted to talk to Joe Brady about being a head coach. So if he becomes available and he becomes somebody who's just a free agent OC, sure, he should be one of the guys you interview. Absolutely.
Yep.
But I agree with you that it doesn't seem like he is available. And if he is available, it seems like he's available for head coaching jobs because that's the only thing that we've seen. So I don't know the legality. I don't know if there's protections around interim tags or if it's something you're allowed to request. I mean, I think you can request it. The Bills could deny it.
And that's the element of this is the Bills could deny it.
Yeah.
You can't deny pitcher
promotion.
Promotion, correct.
Yeah.
From the promotion. So I think it's unrealistic because, and who knows, maybe the Bills are fed up with Joe Brady after 8 games or whatever it is. But unless they fire McDermott, don't we think Brady's probably staying there? Right? Makes sense. Defensive-minded head coach, and they elevated Joe Brady for a reason.
Yeah, and even if Brady were to become a free agent coach, he's going to be looking for an opportunity to continue to call plays, I think. And
there's your element. There's the Zac Taylor element. Yeah.
Similar argument around Dan Pitcher, like, I can work with Joe Burrow again, but Zach's calling the plays. Or, how important is that to Joe Brady? People might be lining up to throw money at Joe Brady. Like I said, he got a head coaching interview with the Atlanta Falcons after the Atlanta Falcons talked to Bill Belichick for the second time. So maybe it's just not going very well with Bill Belichick in Atlanta, but they're casting a wide net in Atlanta. And if you're getting considered for head coaching jobs, taking an OC job instead where you can't call plays potentially, I don't know. Should the Bengals explore it if he's available? Yes. Is he available? I doubt it.
That's what I keep coming back to. If he is available, interview him. Even with Pitcher, interview him. By the way, the Raiders, who are obviously interested in Pitcher, they're interviewing former Bengals QB coach and Browns OC Alex Van Pelt for the Raiders OC job this week. Luke Getsy is another name that's been mentioned for that Raiders job. So the Raiders casting a pretty big net as well. Let's discuss some of the procedural things. We mentioned that the Bengals will have to interview multiple coaches. So let's dive into that coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers.
The Raiders going after Marvin Lewis, his old Bengals coaches. Marvin Lewis hired Alex Van Pelt in 2018.
I think
Marvin
Van
Lewis
Pelt's a good coach. I think he's a good coach.
Yeah, I mean, we were pretty happy about that hire for the Bengals back in 2018.
He was with Zach too for a little bit.
Zach kept him for a year before he was hired away by the Cleveland Browns to be their offensive coordinator. Or was he quarterback's coach there first? Yeah, no, offensive coordinator was initial hire for Kevin Stefanski in Cleveland. So Raiders looking at some of Marvin's old friends. Marvin Lewis, of course, said to be part of that staff with Antonio Pierce. But the Bengals have some requirements to meet before they are allowed to make an official hire at offensive coordinator. This would also apply to quarterback's coach, I believe, but for coordinator positions in the NFL, the Rooney Rule does apply. It was expanded in 2021 and potentially further since then. If you look at the operations website on the NFL about the Rooney Rule, it says that for coordinator jobs, one external minority candidate must be interviewed before a team is allowed to make a hire at coordinator. I think that's been expanded to 2. It appears that that's been expanded to 2. Kelsey Conway has some good reporting around that. Those interviews can be virtual. They can be in person. So the Bengals could be, as we're recording this episode, James, conducting a couple of virtual interviews with some external candidates to meet that requirement, or because there are some people that Zac Taylor knows and is interested in as offensive coordinator options. The Rooney Rule is in place. The Bengals must meet that requirement. We can talk about the Rooney Rule and its faults and its shortcomings if we wanted to. I personally, just to get off my soapbox here, if I can, think it's a flawed rule. It leads to sham interviews. Hopefully that's not the case with the Bengals here, but we know that Dan Pitcher is their top priority. We've talked about that a lot. And so hopefully any interviews they have with external candidates are legitimate, and maybe one sways them, but that is a requirement that the Bengals must meet before they announce an official offensive coordinator of the future.
One coordinator, and I hope it's a real interview. I would reach out to Brian Johnson, the old Eagles OC. That would be someone that would be on my list. Now, I looked just to see if there were any ties to Zach, and there are not, and that's a factor, certainly. Another one, and I'm not even listing names for a Rooney Rule. I just mean potential targets, because you just never know. Zach Robinson continues to get interviews, and quarterback's coach of the Rams was in LA when Zach was as well. I think those are 2 names. And then the other one, and this, again, has nothing to do with the rule, but I want to mention Troy Walters. I think Troy Walters, let's say Dan Pitcher specifically wants to go to Las Vegas because he likes the slots, right? Because it sure as hell isn't because of quarterback play. Well, if he does that, Troy Walters would be on my list, and pretty high on my list. I think Troy gets it. So I think the Bengals, there are candidates, not named Joe Brady, not named Dan Pitcher, that they should look at, or will look at, or at least will discuss. And to your point, they will conduct a couple of interviews as well.
Yeah,
at least.
You go look at the players, coaches that are in the current coaching carousel, that there's some connections with Zac Taylor historically, and that's a good place to find potential candidates a lot of the time. And Zach told Dave Lapham on Dave Lapham's show that there's some guys he knows that he's potentially going to want to talk to, some guys he wants to get to know, and they will have to go through those interview processes.
One more quick thing as far as Dan Pitcher. There are 2 reasons why he could still take the interviews, even if things are going well Bengals wise. And he thinks the first one, pretty simple. They still have to do business as usual and make sure that they meet the requirements of the Rooney Rule, and they do want to look elsewhere. So even if they do think that they're going to get an agreement in place officially with Dan Pitcher, maybe that's something that happens after he interviews with the Patriots today, or interviews with the Raiders and flies to Vegas. The other part of this, if you're Dan Pitcher and you're thinking about becoming a head coach next offseason or the offseason after, taking these cross-country flights, going on formal interviews, that doesn't hurt you.
No.
That experience is valuable. So I think there are a couple of reasons why he might do that.
Valuable experience, valuable connections. Even if it's not OC this year, maybe it's head coach next year for
Yeah.
the New Orleans. I don't know. New Orleans Saints, Las Vegas Raiders, probably not the New England Patriots.
Probably not the Raiders either, but it is the Raiders. But
Yeah.
hey, the Saints. Do you know something, Jake? Oh man.
I know nothing, to
Oh
be
man.
abundantly clear about this. But for a number of reasons, maybe the Bengals are blown away in one of their external candidate interviews that they conduct, because they will have to do at least two. Maybe the Bengals are blown away in some other capacity, but I do believe that their top priority is retaining the services of Dan Pitcher based on the things that we understand right now. Troy Walters, by the way, just in case you're wondering, does not satisfy any Rooney Rule requirements because he is an internal candidate. The Rooney Rule requirements specifically specify external minority candidates. So we'll see if we get some reporting around interviews being completed potentially with the Bengals. You might see some of those between the time of our recording episodes. We're recording this, we're going to publish it. Then you might see some reports of Bengals OC interviews being completed before you hear from us next. But we will have you covered as soon as possible after the Bengals make some moves here on the OC front and we get some more clarity around what will be going on with that position for the Bengals going forward. And until then, we appreciate you listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.